Morning, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity. So this project's finished in terms of its funding. It was funded as a 5-year linkage grant, 2007 to 2011. That's not to say the research isn't ongoing, because it is. It's just that the money ran out. But we've had so much data that we collected from this that we're continuing to research, we're continuing to write papers and continuing to make a difference. Now, as Roberta mentioned, I think the beauty of this kind of research is the diversity of the team. And so when we put together our research team, we really wanted to appreciate the breadth of and complexity of the area that we were looking at, which was how police interface with people who are mentally ill. So I was 2IC on the project. It was headed up by Jim Oglov. And then we had representation from psychiatry, nursing, law, and I'm an epidemiologist. And so we had a pretty broad range of skills, interests, and expertise. We had 2 named industry partners, Chief Commissioner now Ken Lay, who was Assistant Commissioner at the time, and Ashley Dickinson. We had 5 doctoral students involved, all who have completed and all who published from the project, so it's been very productive in that sense. So 5 doctoral outcomes, a couple of honours students through, and 25 or so publications out already. So it's been a wonderful experience to be involved with. Although David did suggest to me today it should be a warts and all presentation. So reflecting back on the 6-year involvement I've had with Victoria Police, I want to raise some of the key findings of the research, but also a couple of the challenges and opportunities that is raised when academia and police interact with each other. So hopefully I'll go okay with that. All right, so the remit was really broad. The project actually came about through Jim Oglov giving a presentation to Victoria Police about mental health in the criminal justice system. And we were approached by the then Chief Commissioner to say, look, we're interested in understanding this. We understand it's a massive problem for us in terms of interacting with people who are mentally ill, but we don't know how much of a problem it is. We don't know what we're doing, how good we are, how bad we are. So we really don't know anything, but we need to start to understand this. So from a research perspective, it was a beautiful proposition that we could actually put together a whole program of research. And we were pretty broad in our aims. We were pretty, I suppose, idealistic in terms of some of the things that we wanted to do. And some of the things that we wanted to do, we weren't able to do on a practical level, but we were still able to produce a really good suite of research. So there were some really quite simple questions that we asked, such as how often do police actually come into contact with someone who's mentally ill? Then we asked some more complicated questions around if police are resolving encounters with people who are mentally ill in a different way due to their presentation, their behaviours, their risks, or due to fears around their own safety or other people's safety, because there's a great deal of research around the relationship between mental disorder and criminal offending. We're interested to see if people who are mentally ill had different pathways into contact with the police services, and if the outcomes were different as well in terms of maybe diversion, use of Mental Health Act to get people into health services, or if they're arrested under the sort of the criminalisation hypothesis that's been talked about previously. This was a big bit though in terms of the practicality. Victoria Police were very keen obviously on getting real-time value and a product which would be beneficial to them. So it was about identifying gaps, identifying learnings, and identifying pockets of best practice which could be learned from. Lastly, it was then a question of, well, if we understand all of this, how can we address it? What can we do to change what we're doing now? Okay, so obviously given 5 doctoral projects, all of them produced at least 3 publications. There's a lot of research to come out of this and a lot of findings. I'm just going to highlight a few of the key points and sort of major headlines that arose from it. So the first point, really looking at, we surveyed just under 4,000 of Victoria Police operational members and asked them just how frequently they came into contact with someone they thought was mentally ill, under what circumstances, what their attitudes were. We looked at issues around social desirability, and we asked them about the challenges as well in terms of resolving those encounters. And what we found out, and I think some of the issues around stigma and mental health stigma come into play here, is that people who are mentally ill have frequent contact with the police, but it's for a wide range of reasons, and police actually perform very much a social welfare role. It's not just arresting the crooks, looking at the bad guys there, doing a lot of things to help people. Lots of crime victims have histories of mental illness, and so there's a much broader repertoire to contemporary community policing than maybe historically was the case. Well, we actually looked at a couple of busy police cells around in Victoria, and this was one of the most staggering findings, that we actually used a diagnostic test on them, the SCID, to look at current mental disorder, and we found that every second person in the police cells where we interviewed had a current mental disorder. And then if you included substance use in that, it went up to over 3/4. And that's just absolutely staggering, that more than, it was 77% of the people in police cells had a major mental disorder. And so the implications around, both their behaviours that are bringing them into contact with the police, and then the police arresting them and taking them to the police cells, suggests some significant shortfalls in terms of the mental health service model, and also the interactions and collaborations between police and mental health. In terms of the third point, through interviewing police quite broadly, and also doing some more in-depth methods, we had a multi-sort of method approach across the different studies that we worked on. We actually found that police are very good at identifying mental illness, and they work really in many ways as proxy mental health practitioners, and we see sort of fantastic examples of case management and referring people through, and just supporting that sort of social welfare aspect of people living in the community who are mentally ill. And some really quite beautiful examples came up through that we've written about. The issue around force is very interesting. In terms of looking at fatal force, so when a person's shot and killed, we found an overrepresentation of all the major mental disorders amongst those who have been fatally shot by Victoria Police. When we looked at non-fatal force as well, a similar pattern arose. All the major mental disorders, again, overrepresented, and that's whether the police officer thought the person was mentally ill, or whether they actually had an established history of mental disorder. Police were resorting to more severe force, more coercive methods to contain and resolve the situation. So understanding and unpacking that is something that we've gone on to look to try and understand, and we're doing some more work with the Firearms Training Academy to sort of look into that in a lot more detail. Really quite interesting findings. The issues around crime victimisation, we looked at in a couple of ways, both with data linkage and through interviewing crime victims. And again, very interesting that people who have histories of major mental disorder, particularly psychotic disorders, are much less likely to report incidents of crime victimisation to the police. It's only when that threshold of the criminal victimisation reaches a violent offence or a sexual offence that they start to become more commonly reported to the police. So we look to try and understand, well, why is that? Why aren't they reporting crimes to the police? And there's a really interesting framework around procedural justice that can be used to understand that. And some of the hypotheses that we've developed looked at issues around that they feel that people who are mentally ill feel that they won't be believed if they tell the police. They feel that it's not serious enough, or that it's wasting police time. And so it's only when there's a third party involved that these issues are actually coming to the attention of police. Also, because they're far less likely to have insurance policies, there's no particular gain for them to actually report things to the police as well. But there's some really simple things that can be learned from the procedural justice literature, and looking at mentally ill victims of crime to understand some really simple things that police can do to help resolve some of these long-standing issues for victims of crime. The last point, really very interesting. A lot of people, too many people, are falling through the gaps, and some of the work that we're currently writing up at the moment has looked at issues particularly around personality disorder, which is often excluded from public mental health service provision, but a massive problem for the police. Issues around missing persons and the high prevalence of mentally ill people in that population. And really, in terms of the mental health service model, there's really something quite significant missing. Our contemporary public health system really doesn't cater for the breadth and complexity of need in the community. And so part of the reform of the Mental Health Act was to look at a new service model. And we put forward this idea of an emergency protective custody unit where police could actually drop the person off at the door, and they would be triaged through a psychiatric assessment process. And so it's really taken a lot of the decision making away from police around identifying signs and symptoms and issues around vulnerability, and just saying there's something not right with this person. I don't know if it's mental illness, personality disorder, substance use, what have you, but they need some sort of help. And then the mental health services can provide that assessment and link them in. Now, challenges and opportunities. First point, you say tomato, I say tomato. And so the song goes, should we consider calling the whole thing off? This point is included really because at the very start of the project, so we applied for fund and we had really fruitful discussions, and we came up with this beautiful program of research. And then we sat down to develop a survey, asking police how commonly they come into contact with people who are mentally ill. And we realised we were talking a very different language. Our clinical and academic understandings of mental illness were really very different to the police perspective of what they considered mental illness to be. And at that point, we started to think, oh crap, I think we're starting to, we're talking in very different languages here, and there's a real discord between what we see as the priorities and what police do. In actual fact, the police are actually thinking far more broadly, because they're not mental health professionals, they're not being asked to diagnose, differentiate. They're just looking for people who have vulnerabilities and may need a different service response. And so for the police, mental illness encapsulates personality disorder, dementia, acquired brain injury, that broad repertoire of mental disorder, as we would call it, but we considered it mental illness, and we were focusing on the Axis 1 disorder, sort of, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, substance use disorder. So really quite an interesting discord at the start that we had to reconcile. Second point, right, is quite an interesting one, because as academics, this is how we're performance managed. Money in, papers out, students through. That's all they care about. If we want to get promoted, that's the mantra that is constantly drummed into us, and in terms of our performance development and just our annual performance reviews. So in terms of outputs, and I think Roberta put it really nicely in terms of how she's focused in her project, the interest for the police isn't in us publishing in medical journals. As academics, we want to publish in the best journals we can with the highest impact factors, these prestige indicators, because quite apart from the money in, we've got to show productivity, we've got to show outputs, and the best journals are medical journals, and the police don't read them. They don't care about that. They're not interested if we publish something in the Lancet or the British Medical Journal or American Journal of Psychiatry. They don't access that. It costs a lot of money to access those journals. So they're saying, look, you've got to publish in things that we're interested in. And we're saying, but they've got horrible impact factors. We don't really want to publish them there. We can get this in a good journal. And they're saying, but police won't read it. It's not going to make a difference. And so there's this real discord, and that's a continued conflict, I think, and something that we continue to need to work on throughout that process. Building capacity is an interesting one. We'd hoped with the PhD scholarships that we offered that we'd actually be able to get a police officer to do a PhD with us. But that wasn't the case, because none of the police officers who showed an interest had the basic requirements to enrol for a PhD. And so I think in terms of taking things forward, this needs to be looked at a lot more carefully. And Inspector Jason Saunders, who's here, is a beautiful example about embedding an operational member within a service and actually providing real-time research, active input, and translating that into practice. And I think that kind of model's the way we've got to go forward. But also the police could do a lot more in terms of preparing police to take up those academic roles as well. In terms of another point from an academic perspective, we always talk about translational research as the buzzword for writing grants. And yet, and we say, it's very good translation of this research, big, broad impacts on policy and practice, but we don't really know because we're not told. And so I think it would be a lot more helpful in terms of getting more funding, research funding support, a lot more helpful if there was that back translation of what's actually happening at the coalface to actually impact on what we're doing and to make that difference, help us get more money so we can do more research and continue that collaboration. And the last point's about continuity. Having worked with this project over 5 years, we've had changes in personnel, both on the academic side, project managers, and with the police as well. And that's an unfortunate, but I think necessary evil in terms of conducting sort of longitudinal research projects. But that being said, there is some problem with that continuity, but it also opens up new opportunities, and I've actually been able to take forward some of the more dynamic areas of the research with new partners and continue to develop that, and had collaborations with Simon Bronnet and CEPS as well through that process. So it has been a very positive experience for me, I must say. Now, just going back to the last point, and really that Ken pointed out at the start, and as the song goes, if you follow it through, this is the Louis Armstrong one. We do need each other, and so we've got to learn to work with each other. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity, that a lot still needs to be learned, and we can be very productive if we can learn how to work together. So thank you very much.